When you hear the word leaven, what's the first thing you think of? For most of us, it's the Passover story, right? The Israelites fleeing Egypt, no time to let their bread rise. It's an iconic image. But what if that's just scratching the surface? Today, we are going deep on the concept of leaven because, according to our source material, it's actually a massive metaphor for how ideas can quietly work their way into a society and change it from the inside out. Okay, let's get into it. So, here's the plan. First, we'll move past the whole bread thing. Then, we'll look at the two very different faces of leaven as a metaphor. We're going to zoom in on the leaven of the Pharisees, then decode some of the original Hebrew words, which is super interesting. And finally, we'll wrap up by asking what this ancient warning really means for us today. All right, first up, more than just bread. We're about to unpack a really old, really important metaphor.
So it all boils down to this one question. We all know the rule from Exodus, but the source we're diving into today says the real point goes way beyond just fluffy versus flatbread. Was this just a dinner instruction, or was it a symbolic warning designed to last for thousands of years?
You know, what's really wild is that even a modern dictionary gets this. First, you have the literal definition, yeast, the stuff that makes dough rise. Pretty simple. But look at that second definition, an influence that works subtly to modify a whole. That tells you right there that this idea of leaven being an invisible, pervasive force isn't some new theory. It's literally baked right into the word itself. And that's the core idea of our source material. The argument is that when the Bible talks about leaven, it's almost never just talking about baking. It's using it as a powerful symbol for an idea or even a social structure that once it's introduced, it just quietly spreads and changes absolutely everything it touches, for better or, as we'll see, for worse. Which leads us straight to our next section, the two faces of leaven. Because it turns out this powerful, sneaky influence isn't always a bad thing. So you've got two sides of the same coin here. On the one hand, there's what's called the leaven of heaven, a quiet, positive force for good. But then you have the other side, which our source really focuses on, corrupting leaven. And that's the kind of influence that spreads things like hypocrisy and moral decay. Let's start with the good stuff, because it's a really cool image. In one of his parables, Jesus actually uses leaven as a good thing. He compares the kingdom of heaven to it. He talks about a woman who takes just a tiny bit of leaven and works it into this huge batch of flour, and that little bit transforms the whole thing. It's a perfect picture of how a small, almost unseen force for good can create massive change. But let's be real, the warnings about the bad kind of leaven are way more common. This corrupting leaven stands for the darker parts of human nature. The source points to stuff like greed and covetousness, these evil inclinations of the heart. It also represents arrogance and pride, and that kind of moral rot that might start small, but can totally poison an entire community. And that leads us right to the heart of our source's argument, the leaven of the Pharisees. This was a very specific warning against a very specific kind of corrupt teaching. I mean, look at this. This is the direct warning from Jesus right out of the book of Mark. He doesn't just say, beware of leaven. He names names. He points his finger at the religious leaders, the Pharisees, and at the political power, Herod. This was not a subtle hint. It was a direct, urgent warning. And what's kind of funny is that at first his own disciples were completely confused. They thought he was mad at them because they forgot to pack snacks for their trip. But he wasn't talking about lunch. The key insight they finally got was that this leaven wasn't something you eat. It was something you believe in. It was the doctrine, the whole system of teachings and rules of the establishment. So how did this doctrinal leaven actually work? Well, the source breaks it down into about 3 stages. First, they introduced all these new doctrines that buried the original spirit of the law under mountains of man-made rules. Second, they set up a system called Corban, which was basically a welfare system funded by mandatory offerings, not voluntary charity. And third, the text argues that this whole system just bred greed and dependency, which completely neutralized the core message of God's law. Okay, let's keep going because this next part is where, for me, it gets absolutely fascinating. We're going to decode the original Hebrew roots to find a meaning that's been hiding in the words this whole time. So the source makes a pretty huge claim here. It says that if you actually dig into the original Hebrew, the very words for leaven and unleavened have a secret warning built right into them. That this isn't just a metaphor, it's an actual linguistic connection to ideas of cruelty, violence, and exploitation. Okay, so check this out. This slide is the core of that linguistic argument. Look at the first word, chametz. It means leaven or sour. But the source points out it also has a related meaning, cruel or grievous. Now look at the word right under it, chamak. Almost the exact same root, and it means violence or cruelty. The source argues this is absolutely not a coincidence. The ideas of leavening and violence are literally tied together in the language. And the flip side is just as mind-blowing. The Hebrew word for unleavened bread, matzah, apparently comes from a root word that means to drain out or to suck out. The source sees this as a picture of a system that greedily devours the sweetness, the vitality, the wealth of a society. So, from this angle, the command to eat unleavened bread wasn't about food at all. It was a command to reject a system of exploitation. So, after all that deep diving into language and history, what's the takeaway? What does this mean for us, right now? Let's bring it all home in this final section, the enduring warning of leaven. You've probably heard this verse before, and wow, does it just hit the nail on the head here. It perfectly captures the whole idea. It doesn't take much to change everything. A tiny, seemingly harmless idea or corrupt practice, once you let it into the dough of your community or your nation, it can spread until the whole thing is transformed. So this is the bottom line. The source argues that the real danger was never yeast. The ultimate warning is about those subtle, corrupting ideologies. It's about systems that encourage greed and make people dependent on some central power. It's about social structures that get so bad that people literally start to, in the words of the Bible, trod on one another just to get by. And really, it's about forgetting the whole point, forgetting the spirit of the law and just going through the motions. And this brings us to the final positive call to action. According to the Apostle Paul and our source, keeping the feast has nothing to do with what's on your dinner table. It's about what's in your heart and in your community. It means choosing to live a life of sincerity and truth and actively pushing back against those corrupting influences wherever you see them. And so our source material leaves us with this one final challenging question. If leaven really is a metaphor for a subtle, pervasive influence, what's the leaven in your house? What are the seemingly small ideas or habits that have the power to slowly change everything around you? Now that's something worth chewing on.